The server room doors burst open. Two guards charging straight at me. My access is purging in 90 seconds, and Julian's voice just announced my removal over the speakers. I've got one encrypted thumb drive with the ledger, but Sarah's just revealed it's not just financial records. It's proof Julian's been watching my home for months. The baton swings for my head. I duck, but the clock's ticking. Too late to run. The air inside the server vault tasted of ozone and recycled nitrogen, a sharp contrast to the scent of expensive bourbon and jasmine drifting from the gala 3 floors below. Marcus Thorne pressed his thumb against the glass scanner. The pad hummed, a low vibration that rattled the bones in his hand before the deadbolt retracted with a heavy, metallic clunk. He slipped inside. Rows of black monoliths pulsed with rhythmic blue light, their cooling fans spinning a frantic, white noise lullaby. Sweat slicked his palms. He wiped them on his wool trousers and then knelt before the central terminal. The interface glowed, casting long, skeletal shadows against the soundproofed walls. His fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard, the clicks echoing like a series of tiny bone snaps. A progress bar crawled across the screen. 4%, 6%. The floor vibrated beneath his boots, the rhythmic thud of a bass line from the party downstairs. Somewhere, a champagne glass shattered, the sound traveling through the ventilation shafts like a distant gunshot. Marcus pulled a silver drive from his pocket. His pulse hammered against his collar. The terminal chirped, a friendly, high-pitched notification that sliced through the hum. Access granted. He shoved the drive into the port. Lines of green code cascaded down the monitor, illuminating the deep creases around his eyes. He stared at the scrolling names, the offshore accounts, and the redacted death certificates. The data hissed into his drive, a digital heist unfolding in the sterile silence, while the elite laughed over caviar and lies a few feet below his heels. Through the thick, soundproofed glass of the server room door, Marcus saw the flicker of a shadow. He didn't stop the download. He couldn't. The black box source code, the heart of the company he had built from a garage startup into a titan, was being reclassified by Julian Sterling. In 10 minutes, Marcus's administrative rights would be purged. In 20, he would be a trespasser in his own kingdom. He reached into his pocket, his thumb finding the small, jagged piece of copper wire. He rubbed it frantically, the metallic scent grounding him as the progress bar hit 80%. The cooling fans seemed to scream louder, a mechanical warning that time was dissolving. The heavy oak doors at the end of the corridor didn't just open. They exploded inward. The sound was a sharp, percussive crack that drowned out the hum of the servers. Marcus bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. 3 figures silhouetted against the bright hallway light stepped into the room. In the center was David Wilson, a man Marcus recognized from Julian's private security briefings, a former mercenary with knuckles scarred from a lifetime of enforced silences. Wilson didn't offer a greeting. He simply tapped his knuckles against the doorframe, tap, 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 the rhythmic signature of a man checking the vibrations of his killing floor. "Step away from the terminal, Mr. Thorne," Wilson said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that felt like stones grinding together. Marcus didn't move. "This is my hardware, David. My code." The 2 guards flanking Wilson moved with a synchronized, predatory grace. One reached for a tactical baton, the telescoping metal segments extending with a terrifying shink. Marcus lunged. He didn't go for the men. He went for the heavy metal server rack door. He swung it wide, the massive steel slab catching the first guard's arm with a sickening crunch of bone. The man howled, dropping his baton. Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy plastic monitor from the desk and swung it in a desperate arc. The screen shattered against the second guard's shoulder, a spray of glass shards glinting like diamonds in the blue light. The air filled with the smell of scorched electronics and sweat. Wilson moved then, a blur of gray wool and calculated violence. He didn't swing wildly. He stepped into Marcus's space, a heavy boot connecting with Marcus's ribs. The air left Marcus's lungs in a ragged gasp. He hit the floor, the cold tile biting into his cheek. Through the haze of pain, he saw the progress bar. Complete. He reached up, his fingers trembling, and snatched the silver drive from the port just as Wilson's hand closed around his collar. "Sarah!" Marcus wheezed, looking toward the shadows near the ventilation duct. Sarah Johnson stepped out, her face a mask of practiced terror. She didn't look at the guards. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide and watery. She mirrored his hunched posture perfectly, a habit of social debt she couldn't break. "I'm so sorry, Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The service stairs. They're still clear." Marcus threw a heavy chair toward Wilson, a desperate distraction that bought them 3 seconds. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his side where the ribs felt like jagged glass. He and Sarah bolted through the rear exit, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. They tumbled into the concrete stairwell, the sound of their frantic breathing echoing off the narrow walls. Down they went, flight after flight, the rhythm of their footsteps a frantic percussion. The scent of expensive jasmine from the gala was replaced by the damp, metallic smell of the building's bowels. They burst out of a side door into the cool New York night, the Manhattan Bridge looming overhead like a rusted rib cage, its shadow cutting across the cobblestones of DUMBO. They didn't stop running until they reached a nondescript brick building 3 blocks away, a safe house Marcus had maintained under a shell company. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of old paper and dust. Marcus collapsed into a wooden chair, his hand immediately diving into his pocket to rub the copper wire. He placed the silver drive on the table. It looked small, almost insignificant, against the scarred wood. "We have it," Marcus said, his voice thin. "The ledger. This is how we take him down, Sarah. This is the proof the SEC needs." Sarah sat across from him, her phone already out. She was typing rapidly, her thumbs a blur. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. Entry number 4114 in her apology log. She took the drive and plugged it into a clean laptop, her fingers flying across the keys to bypass the final layers of Julian's personal security. As the files began to populate the screen, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't just financial records. It wasn't just offshore accounts. Sarah's face went pale, the blue light of the monitor making her look like a ghost. "Marcus," she whispered, "look at the timestamps. Subverted beat 1.4. Marcus leaned in, his breath hitching. He expected to see Julian's secret payouts or the names of the board members he'd bribed. Instead, he saw a directory labeled Project Mirror. He clicked it, his fingers steady only because of the copper wire pressed into his palm. The first file was a photo. It was Marcus, 3 months ago, sitting in his living room eating a bowl of cereal at 2 a.m. The second was a transcript of a conversation he'd had with his doctor about his insomnia. The third was a GPS log of every trip he'd taken to visit his father's grave in Palo Alto. It wasn't just a ledger. It was a comprehensive, minute-by-minute surveillance log of his entire life. He knew. Marcus breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow to the stomach. He didn't just find out I was coming tonight. He's been watching me plan this for months. A sense of profound relief washed over him for a fleeting second. The logic of it made sense. If Julian had been watching, then Marcus hadn't failed because of a technical error. He hadn't been imperfect. He'd simply been outmaneuvered by a superior data set. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time that night, he saw her relax. Her shoulders dropped. She even offered a small, sad smile. "At least we know the truth now," Sarah said softly. "We can use this. We can show the world he's a stalker, a predator. This is better than the financial data, Marcus. This is personal." Marcus nodded, his mind already racing to the next move. "You're right. We take this to the press. We bypass the SEC. We make him a pariah." He felt a surge of hope. Julian had overplayed his hand. By documenting his own crimes of privacy, he'd handed Marcus the rope to hang him with, but it was too late. The screen began to flicker, the surveillance photos of Marcus dissolving into a live feed. It was a video of the very room they were sitting in. The camera was hidden in the smoke detector directly above Marcus's head. On the screen, Marcus saw himself looking up in horror. Then, the true weight of the trap collapsed on him. A new window opened. Public release initiated. Julian hadn't just been monitoring Marcus, he had been editing the footage. The screen showed Marcus in his home, but in this version, he wasn't eating cereal. He was crushing pills into a powder. He wasn't visiting his father's grave. He was meeting with a known data broker in a dark corner of the cemetery. The audio had been scrubbed and replaced with a synthesized version of Marcus's voice, detailing a plan to sell Nexus Path's user data to a foreign government. "He's not just watching me," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "He's rewriting me." The drive hadn't been the evidence Marcus needed to destroy Julian. It was the handshake Julian needed to tie Marcus's personal computer to the forged data he was about to leak to the world. By bringing the drive here, by decrypting it on this network, Marcus had just authenticated the very lies that would end his life. He hadn't found leverage. He had walked into a digital gallows and pulled the lever himself. The silence that followed was broken only by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a helicopter passing low over the building. Marcus looked at his hands. They were shaking. The copper wire fell from his fingers and hit the floor with a tiny, mocking chime. He was no longer the whistleblower. He was the villain of a story Julian had been writing for half a year. The morning sun over Brooklyn offered no warmth, only a harsh, clinical light that exposed the grime on the safe house windows. Marcus stood at an ATM on a quiet corner in DUMBO, the Manhattan Bridge roaring with traffic above him. He inserted his card, his fingers numb. He needed cash, liquid assets to disappear, to find a way to fight back from the shadows. He entered his PIN, the mechanical clicks of the buttons sounding like heavy footfalls in the quiet street. "Transaction denied. Contact your institution." He tried again, his pulse quickening. The same message. He pulled out his phone to check his banking app, but the screen was already flashing a notification. Account restricted. Morality clause invoked. Julian had used the forged drug footage to trigger the fine print in Marcus's contract, a clause that allowed the company to freeze all personal assets of any executive accused of gross moral turpitude, pending an internal investigation. Marcus felt the floor drop out from under him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. $42. That was the net worth of the man who had built a billion-dollar empire. A nearby electronics store had a row of televisions in the window, all tuned to a news network. Marcus stopped, his breath hitching. His own face stared back at him, a grainy, distorted image from the Project Mirror files. The headline crawled across the bottom of the screen. CC launches fraud probe into Nexus Path founder Marcus Thorne. Sources cite allegations of data trafficking and substance abuse. He's fast, Marcus muttered, his thumb finding the copper wire he'd retrieved from the safe house floor. He's not just killing me. He's erasing the possibility of me. He turned away from the window, his head down. But the world wouldn't let him go. A black SUV with tinted windows turned the corner, its engine a low, predatory growl. It didn't pass him. It slowed, matching his pace. Marcus quickened his step, his heart hammering. He ducked into a narrow side street, hoping the cobblestones and tight turns of DUMBO would provide cover. He reached his car, a modest sedan he'd kept for moments exactly like this. He threw himself into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a desperate whine. He shifted into gear and floored it, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. The SUV was behind him in seconds. It wasn't trying to stop him. It was hunting him. The chase tore through the rainy streets, the Manhattan Bridge a blur of gray steel above. The SUV rammed his rear bumper, a jarring impact that sent Marcus's head snapping back. The smell of burning rubber and wet asphalt filled the cabin. He swerved through an intersection, narrowly missing a delivery truck, but the SUV was relentless. It pulled alongside him, the heavy metal frame grinding against Marcus's door with a shower of sparks. Marcus saw the driver, a man in a dark suit with the same cold, unblinking eyes as Julian. The SUV surged forward and swerved, a pit maneuver executed with military precision. Marcus's car spun, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of rain and brick. He slammed into the perimeter fence of a construction site, the sound of tearing metal and shattering glass absolute. The air smelled of dust and spilled coolant. Marcus groaned, his vision swimming. He kicked the door open, the hinges screaming. He couldn't stay here. He could hear the SUV's doors opening, the heavy thud of boots on the ground. He scrambled out of the wreckage, his suit torn, and disappeared into the maze of scaffolding and half-poured concrete. The construction site was a skeleton of a building, a chaotic forest of rebar and shadows. Marcus ran, his lungs burning, the sound of his own footsteps lost in the rhythmic clank, clank, clank of a loose tarp flapping in the wind. He found a gap in the rear fence and squeezed through, stumbling into a narrow alleyway that smelled of rotting cardboard and copper. He paused, leaning against the damp brick to catch his breath. The sky was a thin ribbon of gray far above. He was trapped. The alley was a dead end, blocked by a towering pile of discarded pallets. A shadow shifted at the mouth of the alley. A figure stepped into the light, a man in a hooded jacket, his face obscured. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his waistband and pulled out a combat knife, the blade glinting with a dull, matte finish. Marcus backed away, his hands up. I don't have anything. My accounts are frozen. Look, I have $40. The attacker didn't want money. He lunged, the knife whistling through the air. Marcus dodged, the blade slicing through the sleeve of his charcoal suit. He felt the cold bite of the steel against his forearm, a thin line of heat following it. He grabbed a heavy wooden pallet and shoved it, the weight of the timber forcing the attacker back for a split second. Marcus didn't wait for a second strike. He grabbed a rusted metal pipe from a scrap heap and swung it with all the desperate strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. The pipe connected with the attacker's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the cobblestones. The hooded figure hissed in pain, clutching his arm, and retreated into the shadows of the main street as the sound of a distant police siren began to wail. Marcus sank to his knees, the pipe falling from his trembling hands. He stayed there for a long time, the rain washing the blood from his arm, until the city felt empty again. He was a ghost in a suit, a billionaire with $40 and a bleeding arm, lost in the canyons of his own city. He found temporary shelter in the basement of a 24-hour laundromat, the air thick with the smell of bleach and the humid warmth of industrial dryers. He stripped off his jacket, his fingers brushing against something hard in the lining. He frowned, feeling the fabric. There, tucked into the seam of the shoulder, was a small plastic bump. He ripped the lining open with his teeth, a GPS tracker, the size of a nickel, pulsing with a faint, mocking green light. He stared at it, the realization of Julian's reach deepening his despair. He hadn't just been monitored, he was being herded. He threw the tracker into a running dryer, hoping the tumbling metal would mask his departure. His phone buzzed. A final, cruel notification. Foreclosure notice, 412 Oak Lane, Palo Alto. His childhood home. The house his father had fought to keep after the firm went bankrupt. Julian hadn't just taken Marcus's future. He was reaching back into the past to burn the memories. Marcus sat on a plastic bench, the rhythmic thump-thump of the dryers sounding like a heartbeat. He pulled the laptop from his bag, the one Sarah had used at the safe house. He'd grabbed it in the chaos, a desperate instinct. He opened it, his fingers flying across the keys as he looked for something, anything, that Julian might have missed. He found it buried in a subdirectory of the ledger drive, hidden behind a layer of encryption that used an old, obsolete protocol Marcus had designed when he was 20. Something Julian would have considered garbage code. He bypassed it in minutes. The file opened, and for the first time in 48 hours, Marcus felt the cold clarity of purpose. It wasn't just a tracking log. It was a contract. Julian hadn't just stolen Nexus Path. He had already sold backdoor access to the entire network to a global conglomerate called Global Sphere. The congressional hearing wasn't about oversight. It was a distraction. While Julian stood before the cameras and talked about privacy and progress, the transfer would take place in the background, giving a private company the keys to the personal data of 300 million Americans. Marcus looked at the date of the transfer. It was scheduled for tomorrow, during the noon recess of the hearing. He's not just selling the company, Marcus whispered to the empty laundromat. He's selling the country. He stood up, his eyes hard behind his glasses. The legal channels were dead. The SEC was a weapon Julian was already using against him. There was only one way to stop this. He had to go to Washington. He had to reach the physical servers where the kill switch was hidden. A flaw in the cooling system he'd built a decade ago, a secret only he knew. He walked out of the laundromat and toward the Greyhound station, his thumb rubbing the copper wire until his skin was raw. He was done being the victim of Julian's story. It was time to write a new ending, even if he had to burn everything down to do it. The Greyhound bus smelled of stale cigarettes and floor wax, a grinding, vibrating metal tube that carried Marcus toward the heart of the machine. He sat in the back, his hood pulled low, watching the gray landscape of the Northeast slide past the window. On the small screen of a passenger's tablet across the aisle, he saw his own face again. Julian had released another video. This one was leaked to a national news network. It showed Marcus in a blurred, high-speed chase through DUMBO, the very chase where he'd been hunted. But the edit made it look like Marcus was the aggressor, a deranged man fleeing a wellness check by concerned colleagues. The commentator's voice was a sharp, clinical edge, discussing Marcus's tragic spiral into paranoia and addiction. Marcus felt the weight of the public vilification. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a joke, a cautionary tale for the tech elite. He looked at his reflection in the dark window, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been 48 hours ago. He looked like the man they were describing. When the bus pulled into Union Station in D.C., the air was thick with the scent of industrial floor wax and the distant, rhythmic thud of helicopter rotors. Marcus moved through the crowd like a shadow, his hand never leaving the copper wire in his pocket. He met Sarah in the shadow of a massive neoclassical monument, the white marble glowing like bone in the moonlight. "I have the entry point," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city. She looked exhausted, her eyes darting toward every passing suit. "The Rayburn Building. The hearing is in room 2154, but the digital infrastructure is in the basement. There's a maintenance entrance near the cooling vents." Marcus nodded. "You're sure about the signal jammer? It'll give us 90 seconds, she said, handing him a small black box that felt unnervingly warm. "After that, the federal security grid will flag the anomaly. You have to be at the terminal by then." They moved through the sterile white marble corridors of the Rayburn Building, the silence of the halls heavy and oppressive. Marcus could feel the weight of history in the walls, the crushing scale of a city built to make the individual feel small. He bypassed the first security checkpoint using the jammer, the electronic locks clicking open with a soft, mechanical sigh. They reached the restricted corridor leading to the server room. The air here was colder, smelling of ozone and old paper. Marcus felt a surge of hope. He was close. He could see the heavy mahogany door at the end of the hall, the one that led to the physical heart of the hearing's data stream. "Marcus, wait," Sarah said, her hand catching his arm. He turned, but before he could speak, the mahogany door opened. Julian Sterling stepped out, his Italian silk suit perfectly tailored, his red socks flashing like a warning sign against the white marble. He wasn't alone. 4 men in dark suits, their posture rigid and their eyes hidden behind sunglasses, flanked him. Federal marshals. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Marcus," Julian said, his voice a melodic, predatory purr. "The basement? Really? It's a bit cliché, don't you think?" Marcus froze, his thumb rubbing the copper wire so hard it drew blood. "How did you—" "The tracker in the coat was a distraction, Marcus," Julian said, stepping forward until he was only inches away. He maintained intense, unblinking eye contact. "I didn't need a GPS to find you. I just needed to know how you think. And you always return to the hardware. You think the world is a machine that can be fixed if you just find the right lever." Julian gestured to the marshals. They moved with a synchronized, brutal efficiency. Marcus tried to struggle, but he was pinned against the marble wall in seconds, his breath leaving him in a ragged gasp. A heavy fist connected with his stomach, a dull, sickening thud that echoed through the empty hall. They dragged him into a private hearing room, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glowing records sign above the door. The marshals didn't stop. They threw Marcus to the floor, the cold tile biting into his knees. A baton strike to his ribs sent a white-hot flash of pain through his vision. "Stop," Marcus wheezed, his glasses sliding off his face. "Julian, the data, global sphere. You're destroying everything." Julian sat on the edge of a mahogany desk, crossing his legs to reveal the bright red fabric of his socks. "I'm not destroying it, Marcus. I'm liquidating it. There's a difference. You build things to last. I build things to sell. You're obsessed with the legacy of the Thorne name. I'm obsessed with the reality of the Sterling bank account." He looked at Sarah, who was standing by the door, her face a mask of unassuming apology. "Sarah, dear," Julian said. Do you have it? Subverted beat, 3.5. Sarah stepped forward, her footsteps soft on the carpet. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't look like a woman who had been running for her life. She looked like a woman who was finally closing a ledger. She reached into her bag and pulled out the silver drive, the one Marcus thought he'd lost in the DUMBO crash. I'm so sorry, Marcus, she whispered, her voice steady. Entry number 4115. But I can't be an anchor anymore. I need to be a sail. She handed the drive directly to Julian. The world tilted. Marcus stared at her, the pain in his ribs forgotten. Sarah? You were with him the whole time? From the beginning, Julian said, patting Sarah's hand with a fatherly warmth. She's the one who suggested the Project Mirror name. A bit on the nose, but she has a sense of irony. She's been BCCing me on every email, every frantic plan, every safe house location for 6 months. Why do you think the SUV was waiting for you in DUMBO? Why do you think the accounts were frozen the second you touched that ATM? Sarah looked down at her phone, her thumbs moving. I logged it, Julian. The betrayal. It's the highest severity. Good girl, Julian murmured. He turned the drive over in his hand. You see, Marcus, you thought you were the protagonist of a thriller, the brilliant engineer fighting the corrupt system. But you forgot the most basic rule of data. A system is only as secure as its weakest node. And you, Marcus, are a very lonely man. You treat people like components, like assets to be managed. You never noticed Sarah because you never looked at her as anything other than an extension of your keyboard. Marcus felt a cold, hollow sensation in his chest. Every move he'd made, every narrow escape, every clue he'd found, it had all been theater. Julian had been leading him by the hand, allowing him to feel just enough hope to keep moving toward this room. The kill switch, the Project Mirror file, they were crumbs left on a trail. Why? Marcus whispered. If you already had everything, why the chase? Because I needed you to authenticate the crime, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. If I just framed you, there would be questions. But a man who flees the city, who breaks into the Capitol, who tries to sabotage the hearing, that man is guilty. You've spent the last 48 hours building the case against yourself. I didn't even have to lie. I just had to let you be yourself. Julian stood up, adjusting his tie with 3 precise movements. Take him to the basement storage. Handcuff him to the radiator. I want him to hear the applause when the hearing concludes. I want him to know exactly when the world stops belonging to him. The marshals grabbed Marcus by the arms, dragging him toward the door. As he passed Sarah, she didn't look up. She was already typing entry number 4116. The basement storage room was a tomb of forgotten things. Broken chairs, stacks of 1950s tax records, and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the building's cooling pipes. Marcus was slumped against a rusted radiator, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. The air smelled of damp concrete and rotting cardboard. He was alone. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, distorted sound of Julian's voice coming from a television in the hallway upstairs. The hearing had begun. Marcus looked at his hands. They were empty. No silver drive, no allies, no copper wire. It had been taken by the marshals. He was a man who had built his life on the idea of technical perfection, and he had been dismantled by a simple human error. He had trusted the wrong person. He closed his eyes, the image of his father's bankrupt firm flashing in his mind. Near perfect is synonymous with failure. But then, he felt something cold against his ankle. He looked down. It was a discarded printer cord, its plastic casing frayed, the copper wiring inside glinting in the dim light of a single, swinging bulb. Marcus didn't have a drive. He didn't have a password. But he was an engineer, and he knew that every machine, no matter how powerful, has a physical reality. He leaned forward, the radiator groaning. He reached for the cord with his teeth, pulling it toward him. His heart began to beat with a new, frantic rhythm. Julian was right. Marcus did think the world was a machine, and he was about to prove that even the most beautiful machine can be broken if you know where to touch the wire. The copper wire felt familiar between his teeth, a bitter, metallic taste that reminded him of the wreckage of his first prototype. He spat it out into his hand, his fingers working with a frantic, precision-born speed. He wasn't looking for a back door in the code anymore. He was looking for a front door in the physics. He stripped the plastic casing from the printer cord using the jagged edge of the radiator's mounting bracket. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the raw, kinetic energy of a man who had finally stopped trying to outsmart the villain and started trying to outwork the world. He twisted the copper strands together, creating a crude, conductive bridge. The electronic handcuffs were a modern, smart design, connected to the building's security grid, powered by a low-voltage internal battery. To Marcus, they weren't a restraint. They were a circuit. He jammed the exposed copper into the charging port of the cuffs and touched the other end to the radiator's grounding bolt. A spark erupted, a brilliant blue flash that smelled of ozone and scorched hair. The smell was beautiful. The handcuffs clicked, the internal magnets failing as the surge fried the logic board. Marcus pulled his hands free, the skin of his wrists raw and bleeding. But he didn't feel the pain. He felt the flow. He stood up, his legs weak, and looked at the wall of cooling pipes. The kill switch wasn't a line of code Julian could delete. It was a design flaw in the thermal regulation of the server racks. A flaw Marcus had intentionally left in the blueprints a decade ago as a final, desperate insurance policy. He found the manual override valve, a heavy iron wheel encrusted with decades of DC dust. He turned it. The pipes began to shriek, a high-pitched, metallic wail that vibrated through the floor. He wasn't just turning off the water, he was reversing the flow. In the server room 3 floors above, the temperature would be spiking. The cooling fans would be spinning at maximum capacity, trying to fight a heat they were never designed to handle. Marcus watched the pressure gauge on the wall. The needle climbed into the red, twitching like a dying nerve. 5, 4, 3. A muffled explosion echoed through the ventilation shafts. The sound of a multi-million-dollar hardware array melting into a heap of silicon and plastic. The lights in the basement flickered and died. The television in the hallway went silent. The data transfer was dead. Global Sphere would receive nothing but a stream of corrupted noise. Marcus walked out of the storage room, his suit a ruin, his face smeared with grease and soot. He didn't run. He walked up the stairs, through the sterile marble corridors, until he reached the heavy mahogany doors of the hearing room. He pushed them open. The room was in chaos. The massive digital screens that had been displaying Julian's vision for the future were black. The congressmen were whispering frantically, their faces pale in the emergency lighting. Julian stood at the podium, his unblinking eyes finely wide with a flicker of something that looked like genuine human terror. Marcus walked down the center aisle, the sound of his boots on the carpet the only thing anyone could hear. He stopped 10 feet from Julian. The view from the summit is quite different when the mountain is on fire, isn't it, Julian? Marcus said, his voice a low, steady rasp. Julian gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white. You think this changes anything? You're a fugitive, Marcus. A drug addict, a fraud. The marshals will have you back in those cuffs in 10 seconds. Maybe, Marcus said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, yellowed slip of paper. But they'll have to explain why the founder of Nexus Path had the original, uncorrupted ledger hidden in a physical safety deposit box in Austin 3 weeks ago. The one that hasn't been touched by Sarah Johnson or your Project Mirror team. He looked at Jennifer Garcia, the lead investigator for the SEC, who was standing near the witness table. She was humming a low, mournful funeral dirge, a song Marcus recognized. His mother had loved it. Box 402, Jennifer, Marcus said, his voice softening. The key is under the name Thorne Engineering, not Nexus Path. Thorne. Julian lunged for him, a desperate, undignified movement that shattered his mask of Italian silk and strategic vulnerability. But the marshals were already moving, not toward Marcus, but toward Julian. The red signal of his socks was no longer a sign of power. It was a target. Marcus turned and walked out of the room before the first handcuff clicked. The sun was setting over the Potomac, casting long golden shadows across the park bench where Marcus sat. He was alone. The noise of the city felt distant, a hum that no longer required his intervention. On the newsstand nearby, the headlines were already changing. Sterling arrested. Nexus Path assets seized. Thorne cleared but legacy in ruins. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He didn't have the company. He didn't have the billion-dollar payout. The Thorne name was a brand that would always be associated with the Nexus Path scandal. He had lost everything he thought defined him. But as he sat there, he felt a strange, quiet peace. He wasn't a node in a machine anymore. He was just a man on a bench. A week later, Marcus walked into a quiet diner in Austin. The smell of grease and maple syrup was the most honest thing he'd smelled in years. He sat at the counter, a worn laptop bag at his feet. Amanda Scott, the waitress with the warm, tired eyes, set a cup of black coffee in front of him. You look like you've traveled a long way, honey. I have, Marcus said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh piece of copper wire. Not a scrap from a failure, but a clean, bright strand from a new project. He rubbed it once, then set it on the counter. He opened his laptop. The screen was blank, a white void of possibility. He didn't type a password. He didn't check a progress bar. He simply began to write a single line of code, one that didn't track, didn't monitor, and didn't sell. What are you building? Amanda asked, leaning over the counter as she tucked a sugar packet into her apron. Marcus looked up, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a component. He saw a person. Something perfect, he said, because this time I'm starting with the truth. He took a sip of the coffee, the heat grounding him. Outside, the Austin sun was hot and relentless. But for the first time, Marcus Thorne didn't feel like he was burning. He felt like he was finally, truly beginning to glow.